Yo guys, Superior David here. Scholomance Academy drops this week, and with it comes the glorious first day of an expansion where the meta is not solved and people are generally experimenting with the new cards and having fun. With the exception, of course, being those people who farm wins by jamming fully optimized meta lists from the previous expansion, and those people are inferior. And you guys don't want to be inferior, so I theory crafted 10 decks, one from every class that you can jam on day one of the new expansion so you can be a superior Hearthstone player like myself. If you want to watch me play some of these decks, you can catch me over on Twitch where I stream every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Link will be down in that description. And now let's get into these decks here. So we're starting off with the deck that I'm most excited to play, and that is Ramp Beast Druid. This deck functions similarly to Spell Druid in that we want to ramp in the early turns, but instead of high rolling with an exotic mount seller on turn 7, we want to slam that Guardian Animals to cheat out 2 of our mid-range beasts onto the board. And since they have Rush, we'll also be generating tempo as well. The beasts I'm running in my list are Teacher's Pet, Twilight Runner, and Escape Mana Saber, because a lot of the time, we're not going to be cheating out these minions due to variants and whatnot, and I think these beasts are still decent enough on their own that you're not terribly upset if you have to play them on curve, or even better yet, cheat them out with Lightning Bloom. We also run a couple other big spells like Overflow for draw and Survival of the Fittest as a finisher, so I included some cards that interact with big spells like Anubiseth Defender and the new Groundskeeper. They're also nice against aggro, which are usually the most popular day 1 decks of the expansion, so just like a little tech against those, And since we're running so many big spells, I also threw in Kael'thas for some mana cheating. I'm not entirely sure how necessary he is, but he just seems good when we're running 5 spells that cost, 7 or more mana in a deck. Then as another finisher, we run Ysera Unleashed, which I think is just core to any ramp druid at this point, due to her ability to just generate a board. And this deck just needs to stick one board, and then we win with Survival of the Fittest. As for other new cards we're running, we've got the new Nature Studies because it's really super flexible and probably broken. You can grab removal spells in aggro matchups or get some value in slower games. And then we also run Speaker Ghidra for more early game board control, but she can also be a finisher if left uncontested in the late game, especially when she gets buffed with Survival of the Fittest. That's a lot of damage that you could just send at your opponent's face. Druid as a class was pegged into spell-based decks for Ashes of Outland, and I'm hoping it could start to move away from that in Scholomance Academy, and I think these are the beginning steps. And now we're moving on to an archetype that didn't really find its footing in Ashes of Outland, but I think is still really strong and is also getting some help this expansion, and that is pure Libram Paladin. I played way more pure Libram Paladin than anybody probably should have in Ashes of Outland, and I honestly think that the archetype was almost there last expansion, but the card pool was smaller due to rotation, so, that deck just had cards that we ran simply because there weren't better options. And in Scholomance Academy, we were getting much better options, so I didn't want to reinvent the wheel with this list, and I just opted to swap out some cards that underperformed in my opinion. First, I swapped out Bronze Explorer for the new Goody 2 shields. While it was nice to get a dragon from Bronze Explorer and to get some healing, the stat line was just horrible. We're a board-based mid-range deck, so I think Goody 2 Shields is just better for that game plan. It's aggressively statted and has Divine Shield, so it could also trade up pretty easily, and the Spell Burst effect makes it a must-remove minion that can actually be quite hard to remove for some classes. Then I swapped out Amber Watcher for the new Devout Pupil because, mana cheating, man, that's some powerful stuff in Hearthstone. And while the healing from Amber Watcher was cool, I think it's less necessary when we could possibly cheat out this defensive option early in the game to prevent that damage in the first place. I changed up the early game as well to help contest the board better. Imprisoned Sungill, is a powerful card, but I always found it to be awkward in Pure Paladin because it doesn't curve into Hand of Adal very well, so I replaced them with a couple of First Day of Schools. Even though the 1-drops are totally random, I think it gives us a better chance of getting a playable 1-drop down on turn 1 that we can then buff going into turn 2. Then this next one might upset some people, but I swapped out McGurgle because while decent in the early game, the Prime is actually very underwhelming. I've only had one game where I played the Prime and it actually made a difference, and trust me, I played a ton of pure Libram Paladin. So instead I'm trying one Argent Braggart, probably not as good in the early game as McGurgle, but I think it scales a lot better into the late game, and if it performs well, I'll probably try to squeeze a second one in. Finally, for new cards, we've got the new Paladin Legendary to Rally and the Tenured, taking the place of one Lifeforged Crusader because I don't think we really need the value of 2 Lifeforged Crusaders, and I would rather have that Hail Mary late game tempo swing that Turalian offers. And, the rest of the deck is the same as it was before. There's really only so much variation you can put into a deck when it's pure and Libram, since there's just so many auto-include cards, but I'm very hopeful for this list. Okay, now we got a rogue list that I'm really excited about because all rogue decks for the past year have revolved exclusively around Galakron, but I think there's actual potential for this to change in Scholomance Academy. So the list that I'm going to be showcasing here is a stealth aggro rogue. I sort of approach this archetype like Miracle Rogue, but with stealth minions. I'm thinking like you curve out with your stealth minions and use Ashtongue Slayer and Greyheart Sage to get more value out of them, and then you try to like get control of the board earlier on. We've got the usual stealth minions here, but I also decided to include the aggressively statted Sneaky Delinquent for extra pressure, plus it replaces itself. Then you start preferably going face and applying more pressure with your weapons, but trading if you have to. We're running Hook Scimitar and the new Self-Sharpening Sword. I think Wagglepick has too much anti-synergy with this list, so I think these other weapons are just better. We also have the new Volpira Toxin Blade and Dr. Krasnov to buff our weapons to get even more damage in. And, I think in a deck like this, you really want as many ways to generate damage as possible since we're running the, most likely to be super busted Secret Passage. Secret Passage reminds me of Myra's Unstable Element in that it's really good at digging through your deck to get pieces of burn or buff cards to burst your opponent down. But with Myra's, you were able to draw up to like 10 cards, whereas with Secret Passage, you only get 5. So to me, it seems like you really want a nice density of burn or reach to be able to reliably hit some with your Secret Passages. So this is mainly why I'm running Cold Bloods and Southsea Deckhands, which you don't typically see in Rogue these days, but I think this archetype warrants that. I really hope this sort of archetype pans out for Rogue because it would be super refreshing to be able to play something besides Galakron when it comes to the Rogue class. And now we leave the rest of the Rogue theory crafting to Jay Alexander because we're moving on to Shaman with a much memed about archetype that I think has a chance of being an actual contender this expansion, and that is Totem Shaman. Not only is Totem Shaman receiving more support this expansion, but, overall Shaman is getting a lot of love in Scholomance Academy, and, I think that's reflected in my list. Like, of course, we run all the utility totems because they're awesome to buff and duplicate with Totemic Reflections and Splitting Axe. To be honest, I'm not entirely sold on Trick Totem, though, so we're only running one just to, see how it goes. But honestly, I think the most impactful cards are going to be Lightning Bloom and Diligent Note Taker. Shaman as a class plays relatively fair, so I think getting access to temporary ramp and being able to reuse some of our more powerful spells, including that temporary ramp with the Diligent Note Taker, is going to help out the class a lot. Then we also have a neutral card that I think will be busted in this deck, and that is Tour Guide. One of the problems with Totem Shaman is that your opponent knows that you can go off with buffs and duplicating effects if you stick a totem, so they aggressively clear your board. Tour Guide allows you to either make a totem on turn 1, or you could save that effect for later to make a totem and buff it in the same turn so they can't clear it off, and your opponent won't be able to interact with that, and that just seems so powerful to me. Finally, we're running Totem Goliath and Runic Carvings as our top end to get us back in the game after a board clear. I think Totem Goliath in particular will be a very annoying minion for people to deal with because, if you kill it, then you might be playing into a Bloodlust Lethal, but if you don't kill it, then the Totem Shaman can duplicate it with Splitting Axe because it is a totem after all, and that's just terrifying. So I love token style of decks, and I'm super hyped to try and live the Totem Shaman meme dream when Scholomance Academy drops. Next up, we have Mage, and I think Highlander Mage will still be the dominant Mage archetype, but I think it's just going to sub in a few cards from the new expansion and call it a day, and it's not really going to be that much different. So instead, I decided to brew my take on Tempo Spell Damage Mage. I know a lot of people are including the Spell Damage Payoff minions, and I was tempted to include them in my list, but I think they might be bait. The majority of Spell Damage minions have weak stats, and I don't think the payoff is worth filling your deck with bad cards, so I'm leaning more into the tempo aspect of this archetype and running the spell damage minions that I think are good. So we have cards you've seen before like Astromancer Solarian and Blood Mage Thalnos. Then we run cards like Lab Partner and the new Mage Legendary Mozaki, which doesn't naturally have spell damage, but we can easily give it spell damage with all the cheap spells we run. Now, I know that isn't many spell damage minions, but I think running Primordial Studies will allow us to generate the additional spell damage minions needed to consistently get value from our spell damage payoff cards, mainly Cram Session and the new dual legendary Raz Frost Whisperer. But enough of the spell damage. Moving on to the more tempo side of this deck, we run Sorcerer's Apprentice in combination with a bunch of cheap spells to be able to reliably activate a bunch of spell burst cards. We've got the new neutral 1-drop Intrepid Initiate that functions like a poor man's mana worm, but it seems pretty decent to me. Then we have Flamewaker's cousin Firebrand as a nice mid-game tempo card that could also send damage face. Then we top off our spell burst effects with Wormweaver, which summons 2 mana worms. I'm not sure if this card is too slow, but it's pretty spicy, and I'm excited to find out if it's any good on day 1. And then, I couldn't really figure out a nice way to weave this card into the explanation of the deck, but we also run Wand Thief, which I think is just like a good value 1-drop that's flexible, and you could like get AoE in an aggro matchup or get more burst in slower matchups, or even like a power creation. It seems like just a really good flexible card. But anyways, Tempo Mage was one of like the first decks I checked out when I first started playing Hearthstone, and I'm just like really eager to make this archetype work again. Okay, now moving on to Warrior. I really like big decks, and I cannot lie, so I decided to theory craft a big Warrior for you guys. The general game plan here is to survive the early game and cheat out big minions to overwhelm your opponent. Warrior got big minions that I was really excited about, but I was like super skeptical that they would see play unless there was some sort of way to cheat them out or give them taunt. Then Blizzard just pulls a fast one on me and reveals Commencement, which totally changes what kind of minions you could put into a big Warrior deck. Since you can give any minion taunt and Divine Shield, you can pretty much jam like whatever greedy big minions you want and cheat them out with Commencement, and then they suddenly become great defensive minions as well due to the taunt Divine Shield. So we're running some familiar big minions like Boom Reaver, Scrapyard Colossus, and Deathwing, and then we got the new Troublemaker and Rattlegore, two minions I was super excited about, and two minions that also really benefit from Commencement. We also run Vargoth because, even though he's a small minion, he offers a lot of utility with our big minion cheat spells. Like pulling Vargoth off of Dimensional Ripper is like game over for your opponent if you still have like any big minions left in your deck. Vargoth also has utility with our cheaper spells, one of which is the new Athletic Studies, which allows us to discover minions to play in the early game, but it doesn't mess with our big minion cheat spells, and that's really important. And now the last new card we run is the Ceremonial Maul, which allows us to clear off smaller minions, but also has a powerful defensive spell burst effect that helps us slow down aggro decks, so we can like make it to our big minion cheat spells. Or it could even like be like a big minion effect itself if you play with the Dimensional Ripper. But I don't know. I think you'll probably play this earlier rather than later. And now I guess like the rest of the deck is basically just like an assortment of removal that will probably change as the meta evolves. But I think the big minions we have are pretty good and will lead to a fun time if you play this deck day one. Okay, now onto our Hunter list that I feel almost irresponsible for theory crafting and promoting on my platform. But I know a lot of people like going face, and I hear it's the place, so here's a face hunter list that I threw together. I want to have one deck on here that's more budget, because I strongly believe that you should still be able to enjoy the new expansion, even if you spend little to no money on Hearthstone. And, even though face hunter plays out in a very linear style in that you want to go face with everything and smork your opponent down ASAP, I think some of the new cards add a little spiciness to the list. We've got that tour guide that I mentioned in my Totem Shaman theory craft, and I think it's just as powerful, if not more powerful, in Hunter. If you play tour guide turn 1, on turn 2 you can play Face Stalker and trigger its effect in the same turn, which is ridiculous. Or you could curve into another new card, Mana Feeder Panthara, and you could draw a card on turn 2 with its Battle Cry, which also seems good. And we're also going to be dumping our hand out fast playing this deck. So card draw is sort of important. To keep gassing our hand back up, we run Voracious Reader, which seems like an insanely busted card in any aggro deck. Like, we can consistently empty our hand so fast that it's basically 2 mana, draw 3 cards at the end of your turn. And hey, if your opponent can't clear it off, you get to do it again next turn because you can just empty your hand again. I will not be surprised if this card eventually gets nerfed. And now let's see, the last new card we run adds a little depth to the deck, and that is a single Penflinger. I thought about running 2, but I think 1 is enough since I'm assuming our draws will be a bit more consistent with Voracious Reader. But Penflinger is a cute way to cheese just like a little bit more damage out of our spells. Weave this into your curve before you cast any spell, and boom, you get 1 more damage into your opponent's face, and then you bounce the Penflinger back to your hand. Rinse and repeat. The damage will add up over time, and sometimes that little bit of extra damage is all you need to win a game. So I think Highlander Hunter will still be pretty good in the new expansion. I'm more skeptical about Death Rattle Hunter, but I think this deck beats both of those, so, go forth and smork, guys. Now, moving on to everyone's other favorite class, Priest, I decided to go with a Tempo Priest, which, I actually do like as an archetype because it doesn't revolve solely around generating random cards. Instead, we want to actually curve out with minions from our own deck and snowball with buffs to overwhelm our opponent. Frazzled Freshman is Priest's new 1-drop, and it's just overstated and can most likely survive to get buffed the following turn, which is exactly what this deck really needs. So I think it's innocuously pretty powerful. It also occurs very nicely into Priest's new buff spell, Power Word Feast, which allows you to trade on turn 2, and then your minion goes back to full health. That's pretty powerful. And then, like that curves into apotheosis, and that just seems nuts. You're going to see people like hit this like 1, 2, 3 curve, and then the opponent's just going to concede. I guarantee it's going to happen. Then we take a page out of Cube Priest and run some dormant early game minions because we can play them, and then when they awaken, we could immediately buff them, and our opponent can interact with that. Then we round out our early game with Hot Air Balloon, which I'm not totally sold on, but it's snowbally, so maybe it could put in work. And we've got Voracious Reader again because we have a very low curve but little card draw, so I think we could get a lot of value out of it, especially like if you could slap a buff on it and it sticks around for several turns. I think that'd be really scary to go up against. We top off our curve with a couple Psyche Splits to duplicate our minions that we've been buffing in the early game to further overwhelm our opponent. And then we also run another new card, High Abyss Allura, which to me seems like a good mid-range minion that could get pretty out of control if the right buffs are cast on her. Like, I'm waiting for the games where I cast a buff spell on her and she interfires herself and I could like swing in for lethal. And this is just going to be like another reason why people will love to play against priests. Next up, we have Warlock, and I think most people will be playing some form of Zoo on day 1, so I wanted to go in a different direction, and I came up with a Soul Fragment Handlock. We basically want to play cards that become better the more we life tap / draw cards, such as familiar faces like Twilight Drake, Dark Portal, and Abyssal Summoner. And we also run the new Flesh Giant, which synergizes so well with the new Raised Dead that we're going to use to recur our bigger minions. And then at some point, you slap down Alexstrasza on your opponent and either burst them down with burn cards or you smork them with our big old minions. The Soul Fragment cards are more there for aggro matchups, I think. Soul Shear and School Spirits are just solid removal options against aggro, and shuffle Soul Fragments into our deck that can be drawn for a little healing here and there, or you could use with our Soul Fragment payoff cards. Shadowlight Scholar felt more like a Zoo card to me, so we're not running it here. But I think Void Drinker, though, is a good defensive option for this deck that has the benefit of also being able to apply pressure in a slower matchup. I dig the flexibility of this card. Finally, we have the legendary Soul Fragment payoff card, Soul Seologist Militia, which, I honestly can say that I didn't get that pun until I made this video. But yeah, it makes a board out of nowhere and can also generate a bunch of tempo, so I think it's pretty good. I'm not entirely sure how well Soul Fragment cards will work in a controlled Warlock deck like this one. You usually want to at least have Zephrys or sometimes Dragon Queen Alex in these sorts of lists, but you can't run these cards if you're playing Soul Fragments just due to the anti-synergy. Like, you're literally shuffling duplicates into your deck, so it's very hard to almost impossible to activate those Highlander cards. But all in all, I'm excited to see how this new alternate resource mechanic works out, and I hope to see more of this in the future. Unless it turns out to be super busted and not fun, then just forget you ever heard this. Now, finally, we are moving on to deck number 10, and by process of elimination, we have Demon Hunter, which, honestly, I'm not the biggest fan of as a class. And, I don't think Scholomance Academy is really going to change that, but I promise you guys 10 decks, one from every class, and so help me Yag, you are going to get a Demon Hunter deck, whether you like it or not. I thought Soul Fragments were really cool in Warlock, so I decided to also incorporate them with my Demon Hunter list, but instead of going the control route, we're going Tempo Demon Hunter, which I think suits the class a bit more. The Tempo Demon Hunter shell that dominated the meta up until the recent nerfs is still pretty good, and now we're just sprinkling in some of the Soul Fragment cards to give the deck generally more power in the mid game as well as more reach. But first we got to get those Soul Fragments into our deck, so we got Spirit Jailer, which is, a decent stat of 1-drop, and Marrow Slicer, which to me seems like an overpowered Demon Hunter weapon. Marrow Slicer not only shuffles Soul Fragments into our deck, but it's aggressively statted and curves perfectly into Glybound Adept. Like 2 swings from the weapon, and Glybound Adept represents 12 damage. And, I think it would even run Marrow Slicer and Demon Hunter, even if it was just a vanilla 4-2 weapon, because of the way it curves into that Glybound Adept, and just the damage output is insane. And then, let's see, we run 1 Soul Fragment payoff card, and honestly, I think this is the only one you need in Demon Hunter, and that is Soul Shard Lapidary. Like Glybound Adept, Marrow Slicer just curves perfectly into this card, and this card actually outputs more damage than Glybound Adept, so it's just really good. And while brewing this deck, I was like, yeah, whatever, throw these the cards in the Demon Hunter deck because synergy. But now that I'm talking out loud about them, I'm just like, man, this seems really strong. And then, in terms of other new cards, we round out the list with more really strong cards, like True Aim Crescent, which basically gives your minions targeted rush, and Ace Hunter Kreen, which synergizes perfectly with True Aim Crescent, allowing your minions to trade in with no consequence. And I don't know about you guys, but the more I think about it, the more I think I'm genuinely worried about Demon Hunter this expansion. So I couldn't really say that before this video. So thanks a lot, YouTube. And now we've done it. You've got 10 decks that you could play day one of Scholomance Academy instead of optimized meta decks of expansions past. Let me know down in the comments what decks you'll be playing day one, and make sure to like this video and subscribe for more superior Hearthstone content. I'll see you guys on the next one. Stay superior.